When people think of the vastness of space, they can't help but wonder if we're alone in this universe. Is there any other intelligent life out there? Well, one thing that might prove we are not alone would be a discovery of some kind of alien microbes, even if they aren't the little green men we've all imagined. Just imagine how surprised early humans must have been when they first learned about bacteria and other microscopic life forms. They probably never would have guessed that those tiny microbes were actually more significant to them than any creature roaming around outside. As exciting as that discovery was, it wasn't without its challenges. Some people didn't believe in germs and refused to wash their hands because they thought it would somehow make them weaker. But with time, most of us came to accept that microscopic life is just part of living on this planet. Still, while we know that bacteria are crucial to our survival, that doesn't mean we want them spreading around our house or on our food. We usually try to avoid contact with germs when we can. So what happens if we discover alien life? What will we do with it? Well, back in 1969, NASA seemed to have had this question on its mind when it built a spacecraft known as the Lunar Module. It was meant to carry astronauts from the Apollo command module down to the surface of the moon. It was only meant to stay on the moon for a few days before blasting off again and rejoining the crew in orbit. But NASA didn't know what kind of shape the lunar module would be in after spending a few days on the moon. And they certainly didn't know what kind of contamination it might pick up along the way. So they decided to destroy the lunar module rather than risk bringing it back to Earth. It may seem a little strange to destroy a spacecraft worth millions, especially when NASA has been accused of wasting money many times over the years. But in this case, it makes sense. The lunar module was one of the most important parts of the moon landings, allowing astronauts to walk on the moon for the very first time. If these craft could be reused, then maybe they could be used to establish a permanent base on the moon. At the time, President John F. Kennedy had set the goal of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. NASA was working against the clock and every second counted. However, no one expected the lunar module to survive the landing at all, let alone be reused. After the success of the first moon landing mission, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent around 2 hours outside the lunar module on the surface of the moon. They collected rock samples and took photographs while preparing the surface for future human visitors. When they got back into the lunar module, they left the landing site and headed back to the command module, piloted by Michael Collins. The lunar module was meant to be jettisoned once the astronauts were back in the command module. However, due to an error made by the flight controllers, the lunar module remained docked to the command module until they were ready to return to Earth. This wouldn't have been a problem except for the fact that the crew needed to discard the lunar module before entering Earth's atmosphere. Because of the amount of fuel required to slow the command module down during re-entry, it was carrying less fuel than usual and couldn't manage the weight of the lunar module. With the help of ground control, they managed to jettison the lunar module just in time. But now that it was floating through space without a crew, what was going to happen to it? Well, NASA had already considered this, and they wanted to make sure that the lunar module wouldn't contaminate the Earth if it did come crashing back down. So they decided to destroy the vehicle before it reached the atmosphere. By destroying the lunar module, they removed the possibility of it landing in an uncontrolled state, which would have damaged whatever it landed on and potentially spread dangerous materials around the impact site. So how did NASA go about destroying a multi-million-dollar spacecraft? Well, they could have simply ordered the astronauts to fire their engines and send the ship hurtling towards the nearest star. But instead, they opted for something a bit more dramatic. Before the lunar module was jettisoned, ground control sent a signal to the craft which disabled the automatic pilot and allowed manual control from the ground. Once the lunar module was free from the command module, ground control took over and began steering the craft towards an area of the Pacific Ocean known as the North Equatorial Pacific Remote Area, or NEPRA. It's an uninhabited region of ocean, far from any major shipping lanes or populated areas. In other words, it's the perfect place to crash a possibly contaminated spacecraft. NASA also wanted to make sure the lunar module wouldn't land in Russian waters since the Cold War was still raging at the time, and they didn't want to cause an international incident. Once the lunar module was well on its way to its watery grave, the flight team performed a series of maneuvers to make sure it would break up during re-entry. They also wanted to make sure that it broke up at an altitude of around 27 kilometers above the ocean. That way, the intense heat from re-entry would burn up anything inside the lunar module and destroy it before it hit the water. But things didn't quite go according to plan. The lunar module actually started to break up before it reached the correct altitude. But fortunately, the crew weren't in danger as there was nothing left inside the module. And as long as the pieces fell into the ocean, there was no chance of them reaching the surface. In the end, the entire lunar module burned up in the atmosphere before it ever had a chance to touch the water. While NASA's decision to destroy the lunar module might seem like a waste, it was necessary to ensure the safety of the astronauts and the Earth. But that's not the only reason why NASA did it. You see, the lunar module wasn't completely empty. There was still a camera on board that was recording the re-entry process. By having the camera on board, NASA could learn a lot about how a spacecraft would burn up in the Earth's atmosphere and use that knowledge for future missions. They would be able to test different materials and designs without risking the lives of the astronauts. Of course, NASA had to make sure that the camera didn't record anything sensitive as it was being destroyed. So they removed all identification markings and covered up the serial numbers. They didn't want anyone to know that the footage was coming from a lunar module. However, NASA had another secret up its sleeve. They had actually launched a second camera into space. It was attached to the service module of the command module and was recording the entire process from start to finish. In the end, both cameras captured amazing footage of the lunar module burning up in the atmosphere. NASA was able to use this footage to improve future spacecraft designs and make re-entry safer for the astronauts. While it may seem like a shame to destroy such an iconic piece of history, it was necessary to protect the Earth and the astronauts. The lunar module had served its purpose, and now it was time to move on to the next mission. So what do you think? Was it right for NASA to destroy the lunar module, or should they have tried to recover it and bring it back to Earth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this one. Thanks for watching.